In the fall of 1887, in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, a starving man walked onto a widow's ranch and made her an offer that sounded like an insult. "Give my children milk," he said, "and I will fix everything wrong with this place before the snow buries it." The valley heard about it within a day, and the valley laughed, because in that country, a man who begged for milk was not a man anyone expected to fix anything. What nobody understood, not the mockers, not the widow herself, not even the man's own children standing behind him in the wagon, was that this offer would decide who lived and who didn't when the temperature fell to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there. Somewhere out past the tree line, a winter was already forming that would ask every rancher in the Bighorn Basin the same brutal question. Did you prepare? Or did you only pretend to? Stay to the end, because the answer split this valley clean in two, and only one side of it survived what came down from the north that December. Subscribe now, because you're going to watch a beggar with two hungry children outbuild the richest cattleman in Wyoming territory. And by the time this story is finished, you're going to have to ask yourself whether you'd have laughed at him too, or whether you'd have been smart enough to listen. His name was Eli Marsh, and by the time his wagon rolled onto the Hargrove place, he had 40 cents in a tin box, one good wheel and one that wobbled badly enough to worry, and two children who hadn't tasted milk in 11 days. Daniel was 7, quiet the way boys get quiet when they've watched their father worry too long. Grace was 4, and small for it, the kind of small that made grown men look away rather than look at her too closely. Eli had been a rancher himself once, 2 counties east, until a winter took his wife in a line shack that had never been built to keep a fever alive, let alone a woman already weakened by a hard birth. He didn't talk about that winter. He had learned in the 2 years since that talking about it did nothing but reopen it. So he carried it instead. The way a man carries a stone in his boot he stopped bothering to remove. He knocked on Sarah Hargrove's door with his hat already off his head. He didn't ask for charity. He asked for a trade. "Milk for my children, ma'am, and I'll fix your ranch before winter fixes it for you instead." Sarah Hargrove had buried her own husband the spring before. She had 40 head of cattle, 1 dairy cow, a barn that whistled wind through every seam in its walls, and no man left on the place to help her face a Wyoming winter alone. She had also heard, before Eli had even finished unhitching his horse, that this same drifter had made the identical offer in 2 other counties and been run off from both. She let him stay anyway. She would say later that it wasn't the offer that convinced her. It was the way little Grace had looked at the dairy cow in the pen, like it was the most wonderful animal she had ever seen. Word of the arrangement reached town before supper. Otis Pruitt ran the mercantile, and Otis Pruitt held an opinion about every event within 30 miles of his front counter, whether he had witnessed it firsthand or not. By the time Eli had been on the Hargrove place 3 days, Otis was calling him the milk beggar to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen, and plenty who wouldn't. Cyrus Bell, who ran cattle on the section beside Hollis Vance's spread, thought it was the funniest thing to happen in that basin since the Baptist preacher went through the pond ice at the church social 2 winters running. "A grown man," Cyrus said, trading away his pride for a tin cup of milk. What kind of man does that to his own children? Letting them watch him beg. The nickname stuck the way nicknames stick in small places. Fast and permanent and crueler than anyone quite intended. Children in town took to singing a little rhyme about the milk beggar and his one-wheeled wagon whenever they saw Daniel come in with Sarah for supplies. And Daniel came home one evening with his jaw set tight and refused to say why. Eli heard the rhyme himself once, standing outside the mercantile with a list of nails in his hand. He didn't answer it. He paid for his nails, folded the receipt into his coat pocket, and walked back to the wagon. And the not answering was its own kind of answer, though nobody in that town was patient enough to read it correctly. Sarah watched him take the mockery the way a man takes weather, head down, moving forward, refusing to stop and argue with something that couldn't be argued with anyway. One evening, coming back from town with a sack of nails and a jaw held tighter than usual, she asked him plainly why he never answered the name. Never so much as raised his voice at the men who used it. He thought about the question a long moment before he answered her. "Names don't feed my children, ma'am," he said. "Work does. Let them keep the name. I'll keep the work." It was the longest sentence she'd heard him say since he'd arrived, and it was the one that finally convinced her she hadn't made a mistake letting him stay. What none of them knew, what Ely had never told a living soul in that valley, was where the idea had actually come from. His father had freighted lumber and ore through the passes above Bozeman for 30 years, hauling loads through country that killed careless men inside a single bad afternoon and left the careful ones alone to keep working. Eli had ridden with him as a boy of 10 and 11, watching him build wind camps out of nothing more than brush, packed snow, and whatever the mountain happened to offer that particular night, while other freighters shivered through the same storms in canvas tents 20 feet away, wondering how the marsh outfit always seemed to come through warm. His father hadn't been an educated man. He'd never read a single book on the principles behind what he was doing. But his hands understood something that other men only half grasped in theory, and he said the same sentence to Eli every time they built a night camp, until the sentence stopped sounding like instruction and started sounding like scripture handed down. "Cold ain't the thing killing men, boy. Moving air is. You give the wind something else to fight before it ever finds your skin, and it'll fight that instead, every time, and leave you be." His father died the winter Eli turned 19, caught in the open with a broken wagon axle and no wind camp built in time to save him. And Eli had carried the debt of those words ever since, unpaid, waiting for a place worth spending them on. "Heat survives where air dies," his father used to say too, tapping a knuckle against a packed snow wall the way a man tests a door before he trusts it. Ely had built plenty of shelters in his life that only needed to last one night. He had never, not once, built anything meant to stand through an entire season. Sarah Hargrove's ranch was the first time in his life the debt and the opportunity finally lined up. Hollis Vance ran the largest herd in the basin, 400 head across 3 sections, and he had not built that herd by being careless. And he had certainly not built it by being a fool when word reached him that the widow Hargrove had taken in a drifter proposing to wrap her cattle yard and half her barn in some manner of packed earth fence. He rode over himself to see it firsthand, because he had respected Sarah's late husband too much to sit by and watch her get talked into ruin by a stranger with a smooth tongue and an empty pocket. His objections, when he made them, were not the objections of a mocking man. Hollis had wintered 40 years in that basin and buried enough cattle to know exactly how the cold worked its way into a herd. He told Eli plainly, standing in the yard with his hat pulled low, that a double wall built close against a barn would trap the moisture rising off the cattle's own breath, that the moisture would freeze solid against the boards from the inside, and that ice would split good lumber apart before January was even halfway finished. He had seen that exact mistake kill livestock in a shed not 3 miles from where the two of them were standing. He wasn't laughing when he said it. He was warning, plainly, and without malice. "It isn't the cold I'd worry about with a wall like this," Hollis told him. "It's what happens when a man seals a thing too tight and gives the damp nowhere at all to go." Eli listened to every word without interrupting, and he didn't argue a single point Hollis raised, because every point Hollis raised happened to be true. He only said, quietly, that he intended to build the wall so the damp had somewhere to go. Hollis rode off unconvinced. He rode off, though, having said his piece honestly and respectfully, man to man, and that honesty would matter a great deal more than either of them understood. Standing in that yard in the last week of September, with autumn already turning the cottonwoods along the creek. Before he mounted up, he turned back once and offered Eli one more piece of advice, given freely and without any charge attached to it. "If you're set on building this thing anyway," he said, "you'd best figure out how to let it breathe, or the cold you're trying to keep out will end up trapped in there with your cattle instead." Eli thanked him for it and meant the thanks, and Hollis rode off believing the advice would go unheeded the way most unwelcome advice does. It didn't. Eli turned the sentence over in his mind for 3 straight days before he ever cut the first section of willow. And when the first failure came in October, it was Hollis Vance's own warning that told him exactly where to start looking for the cause. The building started the first week of October, and it started with willow cut in bundles from the creek bottom because the wagon's bad wheel couldn't be trusted to haul the weight without breaking down entirely. Ely hauled it by hand instead, load after load, until his palms split open along the same calluses twice over, and Daniel started wrapping them at night with strips torn from an old flour sack, working by lantern light with a seriousness far beyond his 7 years. Eli wove the willow into a double lattice, 2 woven walls standing parallel, 9 feet tall, set 22 feet back from the barn's north face, where the wind came hardest and meanest off the ridge above. Between the 2 lattices, he packed straw mixed with clay dug straight from the creek bank, damping it by hand and by boot until the gap between the woven walls held nothing but dense, still, unmoving material, 32 inches thick at the base, narrowing to 18 inches near the top where the wind had less weight behind it. He wasn't trying to stop the wind outright, and he told Sarah as much one evening while she held the lantern for him. He was giving the wind something to argue with before it ever reached the barn boards, the exact same principle his father had used building brush camps in the passes 30 years earlier. Except now, made permanent, made to last a whole winter instead of a single frozen night. The full run stretched 220 feet, curling around the cattle yard in a slow arc and tying finally into the barn's north corner. And it took Eli and Daniel 6 full weeks of daylight to finish it. Grace mostly minding the fire and handing up tools too heavy for her small hands, proud of every splinter she earned doing it. Sarah kept the 3 of them fed through those weeks on beans and cornbread and whatever milk the dairy cow could spare beyond what the children needed. And in the evenings, she began bringing a lantern out to sit with Daniel and Grace while Eli worked past dark. Not because she believed in the wall yet, but because she had started, without quite admitting it to herself, to believe in the man who was building it one exhausted evening at a time. "Still air," he told her once, catching her watching him tamp a fresh section into place. "That's the whole secret of it, Mrs. Hargrove. Cold can't kill what it can't reach." He said it plainly, without dressing the words up, and she didn't press him to explain further. because something in the way he said it told her he'd paid dearly for that knowledge once and wasn't in the habit of spending it cheap on people who hadn't earned it. By the second week of October, the frame stood two-thirds complete, and Sarah rode into town for supplies with Daniel beside her. And it was there, outside the mercantile, that Hollis Vance stopped his horse long enough to ask her plainly whether she understood what she was risking on a stranger's word. She told him she understood exactly what she was risking, and that she'd rather risk it on a man who worked from dawn until his hands bled than sit through another winter hoping the wind simply passed her by. Hollis tipped his hat to her and said nothing further, but something in his face suggested the answer had surprised him more than he expected it to. The first failure came on the 17th of October, on a night that dropped hard and fast to 19 degrees, weeks earlier than any cold snap Sarah could remember striking that basin. Illy woke before dawn to a sound he didn't like, a low, groaning strain of wood under pressure, and found a 40-foot section of the north wall bulging outward, the willow lattice straining against something building up inside it in the dark. By full daylight, he understood exactly what had happened. The cattle, pent close against the new wall for its warmth, had been breathing against it all night long, and that breath, warm and heavy with moisture, had crept into the packed straw and clay and frozen solid against the inner lattice, precisely as Hollis Vance had warned him it would back in September. The ice had nowhere at all to go. It had swelled instead, and swelling, it had shoved the whole section outward until the willow finally cracked under the strain. Eli didn't argue with the failure, and he didn't hide from it, and he didn't waste a single hour feeling sorry for himself over it. He tore the section down to bare ground that same morning, working through a cold rain that made the job miserable and slow, and turned the clay to slick mud under his boots. And he studied what was left of the wreckage the way a careful man studies a wound before deciding how best to close it. The mistake wasn't the still air, he decided, kneeling in the mud with a fistful of frozen straw in his hand. The still air had done exactly what it was built to do. The mistake was that he'd sealed the wall too well. He'd built something with no way to breathe at all. He rebuilt the section with narrow vent gaps cut top and bottom, small enough that the wind couldn't drive straight through them, wide enough that the moist, warm air rising off the cattle could climb up and escape before it ever had the chance to freeze against the boards. It was his father's second lesson, the one Eli hadn't fully understood until he was standing in the wreckage of his own first attempt at building something permanent. A wall sealed too tight will rot from the inside, whether from damp or from ice, and a wall that breathes correctly can stand against almost anything the sky decides to send at it. He finished the rebuild in 4 days flat, working through his own exhaustion and through Otis Pruitt's fresh round of mockery in town about the milk beggar's fence already falling down. It never failed again. There were quiet evenings folded in among the hard ones, and the story wouldn't be honest without them. By the last week of October, Grace had taken to naming every section a finished wall after whichever animal had watched her hand it up. The goose section, the rooster section, the one long stretch she simply called Rook's Wall because the dog had slept against it 3 nights running. Daniel had stopped flinching at the rhyme the town children sang. He'd started, instead, correcting them, quietly and without heat, telling them it wasn't a beggar's fence at all. It was his father's fence, and one day it would be the only warm barn left standing in the whole basin. Nobody believed him yet. He kept saying it anyway. Sarah found herself some nights, standing at her kitchen window a little longer than the dishes required, watching a man she'd taken in as an act of desperate charity slowly become the reason her ranch might survive the season at all. By August, the grass on the Hargrove Range had already turned pale and thin, an early warning Sarah had chosen not to dwell on. By October, the wall stood two-thirds risen, bleeding palmed and imperfect, but climbing. By the middle of November, it stood finished entirely, the barn tucked warm and quiet behind its curve, and the valley had mostly stopped talking about the milk beggar. Not because anyone's mind had changed, but because there was nothing fresh left to mock. Then, the animals began acting strange. Rook, the lean grey cattle dog, who had slept every night of his life, curled tight against the old barn wall, stopped sleeping there entirely, and took instead to lying pressed against the kitchen step, refusing to be coaxed back out even with the bribe of bacon rind Grace offered him nightly. The geese that usually held the pond until early December left in the second week of November, all at once, in a single grim formation that an old trapper named Silas Pratt, 40 winters survived in that country, 3 wives outlived to prove it, watched go with an expression Sarah didn't much care for. Silas rode by the Hargrove place on the 28th and simply stood a long while in the yard, listening. There wasn't a single sound in the air. No wind, no bird call, nothing at all. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, but a held breath, the whole valley waiting on something it hadn't named yet. Something's coming that hasn't got a name yet, Silas told her at last, and I don't much care for how quiet it's being about arriving. He wouldn't say more than that. Old men who had survived enough winters rarely needed to say more. Sarah brought the children inside earlier than usual that night and pulled the door tight, and didn't sit by the window the way she'd taken to doing most evenings that autumn. Eli walked the length of the wall once more before full dark, running a bare hand along every vent gap to be sure the last of them sat clear. The way a man checks a door he already knows is locked, but checks again anyway, because the checking is the only thing left within his power to do. Rook wouldn't leave the kitchen step at all that night, not even for the bacon rind. By the morning of December the 8th, the sky had gone a flat, colorless grey that held no wind in it whatsoever, and the whole basin seemed to be waiting on something it had no name for yet. It came down from the north on the 9th of December, and within 18 hours, men in 3 counties were already calling it the long cold. The temperature fell to 38 degrees below zero, driven sideways by wind that stripped the snow off open ground as fast as it fell and packed it instead into drifts hard as river stone against every fence and wall in the basin. Nature had arrived, and nature in that country arrived without the slightest interest in negotiating its verdict. It didn't care who had built what that autumn, or who deserved to survive the winter, or who had laughed at whom back in October over a fence made of willow and mud. It only ever asked the one question it had ever asked in that valley. Could the wind get in? For 3 straight days, it tested every wall, every roof, every hairline seam in every building across the basin, with the patience of a judge who had the whole winter to work with and no reason whatsoever to hurry the verdict. On the second night of the storm, the vent gaps Ely had cut into the north wall began to ice shut, choked by wind-driven snow packing tight into the narrow openings meant to let exactly this kind of weather stay outside. Without those gaps open, the moist breath of 40 head of cattle would have nowhere left to escape, and the entire envelope he'd spent 6 aching weeks building would freeze solid from the inside. The very same failure that had cracked the wall in October. Except now, at 38 below, with no morning left afterward to fix it in. Eli went out into it anyway, a rope knotted from his waist to the barn door, because a man who lost that rope in a whiteout like that one wouldn't find his way back by sight or sound or anything but blind, undeserved luck. He couldn't see his own outstretched hand at arm's length. He worked entirely by feel, chipping ice from the vent gaps with a hand axe, his fingers going from painful to numb to something worse than numb in the space of 20 minutes. Until Rook's barking, sharp, close, and unrelenting from the doorway, became the only thing telling him which direction held the door and which direction held nothing but open, frozen rain. He cleared the last vent and started back along the rope with his hands too frozen to properly close around it. And it was the dog, pressed hard against his legs for the last 30 feet, that kept him walking a straight line instead of the slow curve a disoriented man walks in a whiteout without ever knowing he's drifting. Twice more, before dawn, the wind found new weaknesses to test. A section of woven willow near the barn corner, working loose under the strain. A drift building fast enough against the yard gate to threaten burying it shut. And twice more Eli went back out on the rope to answer it, each trip shorter than the last, only because his body had less left to give with every crossing. Sarah stood at the door both times, with the lantern held high against glass gone white with frost, counting the seconds of rope slack the way another woman might count a held breath, until the door opened again, and he came through it, half frozen, but upright. He made it back inside for the final time, with frost already whitening 2 fingers on his right hand. Sarah wrapped them in wool, soaked in warm water, while Daniel held the lantern steady, and Grace sat pressed against her father's side, silent and wide-eyed. And nobody in that kitchen spoke above a whisper, until the shaking in his hands finally stopped. He did not go back out into it again that night. He didn't need to. The storm broke on the morning of the 12th, and what it left behind told its own story, without a word of help from anyone left standing to tell it. Hollis Vance lost 60 head of cattle across 3 days, frozen up hard against the north wall of a barn built solid and tight in the ordinary way, sealed against every draft a careful rancher knew to seal against, and sealed, therefore, against any escape at all for the warm, wet breath that turned to ice against the boards, the very same failure Eli had once torn down and fixed at the Hargrove place in October. Except Hollis had no vents cut anywhere to let his own version breathe. Sarah Hargrove lost none, not one animal, out of 40. On the 13th, Hollis rode over himself with a thermometer in his coat pocket and a look on his face that carried none of the confidence he'd worn back in September. He held the thermometer against the outside of the willow wall first, where it read 19 degrees below zero, matching the misery all around it. Then he pressed it flat against the barn wall on the inside of the envelope, where the still, trapped air, breathing slow and steady through Eli's narrow gaps, held the temperature at 51 degrees above freezing. Hollis didn't say anything at all for a long moment. He put his bare palm flat against the warm inner wall the way a man tests a stove before he trusts it with his hand, and he left it resting there, and the numbers on that thermometer required no interpretation from either man standing in that yard. "I was wrong," he said finally. Just the 2 words, offered plainly, standing in the wreckage of his own confidence, with his hand still pressed to the wall that had proven him so completely. The knock came 4 nights later, well past dark, And it was Otis Pruitt, standing on the step, with his hat in both hands and his own dog, nearly frozen stiff, in the sled behind him, come to ask, in a voice that plainly cost him something to use, whether there might be room in the Hargrove barn for what remained of his milk cow and his 2 surviving hens, because his own shed hadn't held against the long cold the way he'd assumed it would. Cyrus Bell arrived the next morning with much the same request and much the same posture. A man who had once sung a mocking rhyme about a stranger's wagon wheel, now standing quiet and hatless in that same stranger's yard. Eli let them both in without a single word about the milk, without a single word about the wheel, without one syllable that could be mistaken for satisfaction at how the winter had settled its own accounts. He simply showed them where the warmest corner of the barn stood and helped them settle their animals into it, exactly the way he'd have helped anyone at all, because there was no debt being collected that night, only shelter, quietly shared with men who had once refused to share so much as a kind word. Sarah watched him do it and understood, more clearly than at any single point across that whole long autumn, exactly what kind of man had walked onto her ranch in September, asking only for milk. Word of the 2 thermometers traveled the basin faster than the snow itself had. By the time the passes cleared enough for wagons in late January, there wasn't a rancher within 30 miles who hadn't heard the numbers repeated at least twice. 19 below on one side of a wall, 51 above on the other, and 40 cattle standing alive to prove which side had told the truth. Silas Pratt, who rarely offered praise to anyone, allowed that he hadn't seen a man read a winter that correctly since his own father's time, and coming from Silas, that counted for more than a whole church full of compliments. Otis Pruitt stopped telling the wagon wheel joke entirely, and when a peddler passing through tried to tell it fresh, not knowing any better, Otis was the one who told him to let it lie. By the following autumn, 4 other ranches across the basin had raised their own version of the wall, each one adjusted for its own ground and its own barn, but every single one of them built on the identical principle Eli had carried west from a mountain pass and a father's grave, a double wall, packed dense and still, breathing narrow and slow. Nobody called it the milk beggar's fence anymore. Hollis Vance, in particular, made a deliberate point of calling it something else, loudly and often enough, until the new name took hold across the whole valley the way names do, when a respected man insists on them at every gathering he attends. They started calling it the Marsh Wall, and within 2 winters, nobody in the Bighorn Basin remembered the children's rhyme, or the wagon with the bad wheel, or the 11 days without milk that had started the whole thing. They only remembered the wall that had worked when every other wall in the valley had failed. The strongest wall in that country was never the one built to keep everything out. It was the one built to let the right things breathe and the right people in when the knock finally came. So ask yourself honestly, would you have laughed at a stranger who showed up begging milk for his children in exchange for saving your ranch? Or would you have been one of the rare few willing to listen to what he already knew about surviving the cold?